Welcome back to Jack and Rex Tales. The rain did not fall that night. It attacked. It came down in cold, angry sheets across the empty Oregon highway, hammering the pine trees, swallowing the road signs, turning the world into a blur of gray and black. Thunder rolled low across the hills above Maple Hollow, deep and warning, the way it does when the sky has decided it has something important to say. Inside his old red pickup truck, Jack Thompson leaned forward in his seat, squinting through the windshield as the wipers fought to keep up. His hands rested on the wheel, large, weathered hands, scarred at the knuckles, lined with decades of hard work and harder living. Hands that had carried rifles and sandbags, and the weight of men who didn't make it home. Hands that had also held his dying wife's fingers in a hospital room 8 years ago, and hadn't held anything tender since. He was 60 years old, retired Army, 2 tours, 3 commendations, and a Purple Heart he kept in a shoebox under his bed because he never felt right about displaying it. The men who deserved to display medals, he always said, were the ones who didn't come home. Beside him in the passenger seat, Rex sat perfectly upright. He was a German Shepherd, 7 years old, broad-chested and alert, with eyes the color of dark amber that missed absolutely nothing. Even now, in the middle of a violent Oregon storm, Rex sat like a soldier on watch, ears forward, gaze steady, body still. He had been trained as a military working dog before an injury ended his service, and Jack had adopted him the same week he himself had retired. 2 veterans, people in town like to say. Same eyes, same quiet. Rex turned his head and looked at Jack. "I know, boy," Jack murmured softly. "Almost home." The truck pushed through the storm. The heater hummed. The radio had given up signal 20 minutes ago, leaving only the sound of rain and wind and the occasional low rumble of thunder. Jack reached over and rested his hand briefly on Rex's back, and the dog leaned into it, just slightly, the way he always did. They were 5 miles outside of Maple Hollow when Rex stiffened. Not the kind of playful alertness, not curiosity. This was different. His ears pulled back sharply. His body went rigid. A sound rose from deep in his chest, low, controlled, deliberate. A warning growl. "What is it?" Jack said, sitting up straighter. Rex's gaze locked onto something ahead in the darkness. Jack slowed the truck. At first, he thought it was a signpost, a shadow, a trick of the lightning, but then the sky split open with a white flash, and in that half-second of brilliant light, he saw her. A woman. Standing alone on the side of the road, military fatigues soaked completely through, a heavy duffel bag at her feet sinking into the mud, her arms hanging at her sides, her face tilted slightly down as though she had been staring at the ground for a very long time and had simply forgotten to look up. She wasn't waving for help. She wasn't running for shelter. She was just standing there, in the middle of a violent storm, on an empty road in the dark. The way people stand when they have forgotten that moving forward is still an option. Rex barked, once, sharp and certain. "I see her, Rex," Jack said quietly. He pulled the truck to the shoulder without a second thought. He zipped his jacket, pushed open the door, and stepped out into the rain. It hit him immediately, cold and relentless, soaking through his jacket within seconds. He walked toward her slowly, deliberately, both hands visible at his sides. Old soldier instincts. Always approach calmly, never startle someone who has seen combat. "Ma'am," he called over the rain. "You okay?" Her eyes were sharp, dark, trained. The eyes of someone who had learned to scan a room, read a situation, and decide in half a second whether to trust. But underneath that sharpness, underneath that discipline, there was something else. Something cracked and exhausted and very, very tired. "I'm fine," she said immediately. Jack studied her for a moment. Her lips were pale, her hands were trembling, not from fear, he suspected, but from cold. She had been standing here a long time. "No, ma'am," he said gently. "You're not." She held up her phone. "Roadside assistance. I'm waiting on a callback." "There's no signal for the next 4 miles. I lost mine back at the ridge." She looked down at her phone. The screen was dark. She already knew. The storm roared around them. Neither of them moved. "I've got a warm house about 10 minutes from here," Jack said. "Coffee on the counter, a fireplace that actually works, and a dog who has very strong opinions about letting people stand in the rain." He paused. "You're welcome to wait out the storm there." "I don't need charity," she said. "Neither do I," Jack replied. "Just one soldier helping another." Something shifted in her face. The hard line of her jaw softened, just barely. Her eyes moved past Jack to the truck, where Rex sat watching through the passenger window, his breath fogging the glass. "That your dog?" she asked. "That's Rex. He's the one who spotted you." For a long moment she said nothing. The rain poured, the thunder rolled, and then, slowly, something in her broke open. Not dramatically, not with tears, just quietly, the way exhausted people finally stop pretending. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." Her name was Tessa Marlowe. She was 34 years old, 9 years in the Army, 2 tours overseas, and honorably discharged 3 weeks ago. She told Jack her first name in the truck on the way to the cabin, and nothing else. He didn't ask for more. He had learned long ago that some stories need warmth before they can be spoken. The cabin smelled like cedar wood and old books and coffee. Jack turned on the lights, stoked the fireplace, and put a fresh pot on the stove. Tessa stood near the door for a moment, dripping on the welcome mat, looking around the small, quiet space the way soldiers look at unfamiliar rooms, cataloging exits, reading the environment, deciding if it was safe. And then Rex walked up to her. He didn't bark, he didn't jump. He simply walked over slowly, lowered his great head, and pressed his nose gently against her hand. Then he sat down at her feet and looked up at her with those dark amber eyes, patient, steady, completely without judgment. Tessa stared at him. Her chin trembled, just once. "He does that," Jack said from the kitchen. "Knows who needs him." She reached down slowly and placed her hand on top of Rex's head. He didn't move. He just leaned into her palm, warm and solid and present, and for reasons she could not have explained, that small gesture nearly undid her completely. She exhaled slowly, sat down in the chair nearest the fire. Rex laid himself across her feet and closed his eyes. He wasn't going anywhere. Dinner was simple. Tomato soup and warm cornbread, the kind Jack made from a recipe his wife had written on a note card and taped inside the cabinet door. He had never taken it down. Tessa ate it slowly, quietly. Rex lay between them, his head resting on his paws, his eyes moving from one to the other. After a long while, she spoke. 9 years, she said softly. 2 deployments. I thought getting out would feel like relief. She paused. It just feels like falling. Jack set down his spoon. He didn't offer a quick answer. He didn't try to fix it. He just listened, the way men do when they have lived long enough to know that some pain simply needs to be witnessed. "I lost someone over there," she said. Her voice didn't break, it just went very quiet. "His name was Jared." The fire crackled. Rex raised his head and rested his chin on Tessa's knee. She looked down at him, swallowed hard. He was... She stopped, started again. He was the kind of person who made you believe the world was going to be all right, even when it wasn't. Her hand found Rex's ear, and she stroked it slowly. "I've been carrying a letter he wrote me, before his last mission. I've had it for 4 months, and I've never opened it." Jack was quiet for a long moment. "My wife," he said simply. "Cancer. Took her slowly. Worst kind of enemy, the one you can't outrun, can't outfight, can't bargain with." He looked toward the window. "After she passed, I kept setting 2 coffee cups every morning, for almost a year." He paused. Couldn't stop, because stopping felt like admitting she was gone. Tessa looked at him with something new in her eyes, not pity, recognition. "I still do it," he added quietly. Rex stood up from Tessa's feet, walked around the table, and pressed himself against Jack's leg. The old man reached down and scratched behind his ears without looking. His jaw tightened. His eyes shone. "Good boy," he whispered. That night, Tessa lay on the couch beneath a quilt Jack had pulled from the closet. His wife's quilt, the one with the blue and yellow squares. He didn't mention that. He just handed it to her and said, "It's warm." She held the sealed letter in both hands in the darkness, turning it over and over. The handwriting on the envelope, her name in Jared's careful print, was beginning to blur at the edges from being handled so many times. She wasn't ready. She wasn't sure she would ever be ready. From across the room came the soft sound of Jack sleeping in his armchair, his breathing slow and even. And from the floor beside the couch, she heard something else, a quiet, steady warmth against her hand as Rex rested his head on the edge of the cushion beside her. She looked down at him in the darkness. He was watching her, calmly, steadily, those amber eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. Not demanding anything, not asking her to be all right, just staying. She reached out and placed her hand on his head. "I don't know what I'm doing, Rex," she whispered. He exhaled slowly through his nose, a long, warm breath. And somehow, that was enough. That night, for the first time in 4 months, Tessa Marlowe slept without nightmares. She intended to leave in the morning. She stayed for 3 days. The first morning, she woke to the smell of bacon and fresh coffee, and Jack standing at the stove humming something old and country and half-remembered. Rex was sitting beside the stove watching him cook with the focused attention of someone who had a personal stake in the outcome. "Morning," Jack said without turning around. "Morning," she said. She sat down at the table slowly. "I can't remember the last time someone cooked breakfast for me." Jack set a plate in front of her. "That's because the world got too busy." He sat down across from her. "It forgot that breakfast is how you tell someone they matter." She looked at the plate, then at him. Then she picked up her fork. Rex promptly appeared beside her chair and placed his chin on her knee, looking upward with enormous, unsubtle hope. "He does this every morning," Jack said flatly. "Does it work?" "Every single time." She laughed. It was small and surprised and real, the kind of laugh that escapes before the person remembers they weren't planning to laugh. Jack smiled at his plate and said nothing. On the second day, Tessa wandered behind the cabin and found the shed. Inside, against the far wall, stood an old upright piano. The wood was worn, the keys slightly yellowed, but it was tuned. She could tell by the way the sound filled the small space when she pressed a single note. She sat down on the bench, and without quite deciding to, she began to play. It was a simple melody, quiet and slow and aching, something she had learned as a girl and never forgotten. The music drifted out through the shed's small window, across the wet pine needles in the quiet yard, and into the open cabin door. Jack stopped moving. He was standing at the kitchen counter with a dish towel in his hands. He stood perfectly still, because the melody coming from the shed was the same melody his wife had played every Sunday evening for 31 years. The same notes, the same gentle rhythm, exactly the same. He walked slowly to the back door and stood in the frame. When Tessa finally looked up, he was there, and his eyes were full, not with grief exactly, but with something more complicated and more beautiful than grief. "She loved that song," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. Tessa's hands stilled on the keys. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "Don't be sorry," he said quietly. "It's the first time in 8 years I've heard it and felt grateful instead of broken." Rex appeared from behind Jack's legs and walked slowly into the shed. He sat down beside the piano bench, looked up at Tessa, and placed one large paw on her foot. She looked down at him. Her eyes filled. She played the song again, all the way through, and Jack stood in the doorway of that old shed in the Oregon morning and let himself remember his wife with love instead of loss. Because that is what music does when it arrives at exactly the right moment. And that is what kindness does when it is patient enough to wait. On the third evening, Tessa opened the letter. She sat by the fireplace, Rex pressed warm and solid against her side, his breathing slow and even. Her hands shook slightly as she unfolded the paper, but she read it, every word. Jared had not written goodbye. He had written instructions for living. He told her she was the strongest person he had ever known, and that strength like hers was not meant to be spent on grief. He told her to find somewhere that felt like home and to stay there. He told her to let people in, even when it was terrifying. He told her to be happy, not eventually, not someday, but on purpose, starting now. And at the very end, in his careful handwriting, he had written, "Don't carry me like a weight, Tess. Carry me like a reason." She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. Rex pressed closer. He rested his heavy head across her lap and exhaled deeply, long and warm and steady, as though he understood, as though he had been waiting for her to finally read it so he could help her hold what came after. She placed her hand on his back and felt his heartbeat beneath her palm, slow and certain and alive. "He told me to keep living," she told Jack when he came in from the kitchen. Jack sat down slowly in his armchair. Rex looked at him across the room, then looked back at Tessa. "Good man," Jack said simply. "He was right." 2 weeks later, Tessa received a phone call. A veteran support organization in the county was looking for a transition counselor, someone who had served, who understood the gap between military life and civilian life, who could sit across from a struggling veteran and say, with complete honesty, "I know what this feels like, and I promise you there is a way through." The position was in Maple Hollow, 10 minutes from Jack's cabin. She called Jack to tell him. Rex barked in the background before she even finished the sentence, and she took that as a sign. But peace, as soldiers know better than anyone, rarely arrives without one final battle. It came on a Thursday evening, a knock at the cabin door, firm, official, deliberate. Jack opened it to find a woman with a clipboard and careful eyes, a social worker. She explained in the practiced language of forms and procedures that members of Jack's estranged family had raised concerns. They felt he was too old to be living alone, too isolated. They were exploring options. There would be assessments, possibly recommendations. Jack stood in his doorway and said nothing, but something changed in his face, something that Tessa, watching from the hallway, had never seen before. The quiet veteran who had faced 2 wars and a decade of grief and the slow silence of an empty house. For the first time, he looked afraid, small, uncertain, like a man being told that the life he had rebuilt slowly and painfully and with great care might be taken from him. The social worker left her card and her clipboard notes and said she would be in touch. Jack closed the door. He stood with his back to the room for a long moment, his shoulders, usually so straight, curved forward slightly. His hand was still on the doorknob. Rex walked to him immediately. He pressed his entire body against Jack's leg, firm and warm and deliberate, and looked up at his face. When Jack didn't move, Rex made a sound, not a bark, something softer. A low, gentle sound from deep in his chest, the kind of sound that means, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. You are not alone." Jack's hand came down from the doorknob and found Rex's head. His eyes closed. Tessa stepped forward. "Jack," she said quietly. He turned slowly. "You stopped for me in the worst storm I had ever stood in," she said. "You opened your door. You fed me. You let Rex sit at my feet until I remembered how to breathe." Her voice was steady and warm and sure. "You are not alone. Not anymore. And no one, no clipboard, no form, no distant relative who wasn't here for any of it gets to decide what your life looks like. Not while I'm standing in it." Jack looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked. His eyes shone. "You really think I've still got something left?" he asked. His voice was barely above a whisper. Tessa didn't hesitate. "I know you do, Jack. I know it the same way Rex knew to growl when he saw me standing in that rain, the same way Jared knew to write me a letter about living instead of goodbye." She paused. "Some people are not finished. They're just waiting for someone to remind them." Rex looked between them both. Then he sat down squarely in the center of the room, tall and dignified, as though officially presiding over the moment. Jack laughed. A real laugh, rough and warm and surprised. "All right, Rex," he said. "Message received." That evening they cooked together, a proper dinner, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and the cornbread from the note card taped inside the cabinet door. They ate at the table with the fireplace going and the rain tapping softly against the windows, and at some point during the meal they were both laughing about something Rex had done, and the laughter filled the cabin completely, corner to corner, the way laughter does when it has been missing from a place for too long and is finally allowed back in. After dinner, Jack washed and Tessa dried. Rex lay across both their feet simultaneously, which made the task considerably more difficult and considerably warmer. When the kitchen was clean and the fire was low and the rain had softened to a gentle rhythm against the glass, Jack sat back in his armchair and looked at the room, at Tessa reading on the couch, at Rex sprawled between them like a living, breathing bridge between two people who had both been lost and had somehow, improbably, found each other. He thought of his wife, not with the old ache, but with gratitude, with the quiet understanding that loving someone fully once does not use up love. It teaches you how to recognize it when it returns, in different forms, wearing different faces, arriving on stormy Thursday nights in military fatigues. He thought of Jared's letter. "Don't carry me like a weight. Carry me like a reason." He thought of Rex, who had seen Tessa first, who had growled in the dark and refused to let a soldier stand alone in the rain. And he understood something he hadn't understood before. Life had not ended at 60. It had simply been waiting, the way good things sometimes do, for the right storm, the right road, the right moment when a man who had given everything decided to stop one more time and offer what he had left. And it was enough. It was more than enough. Real courage, friends, is not always loud. It is not always on a battlefield or marked with a ceremony or pinned to a uniform. Sometimes it is a man pulling over in a rainstorm. Sometimes it is a woman finally opening a letter she was afraid to read. Sometimes it is a dog pressing his warm weight against someone who is trembling in the dark, staying there until the trembling stops. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to let another person stand alone. Jack Thompson knew something that took him 60 years and one Oregon storm to fully understand, that a life spent in service does not end when the uniform comes off. It continues in every small act of decency, every door opened, every cup of coffee offered, every moment you choose kindness when you could have driven past. And Rex, that quiet, faithful, golden-eyed dog, knew it all along. If this story found you today, perhaps it found you for a reason. Perhaps you needed to be reminded that it is never too late, that healing is still possible, that the people who change your life rarely arrive with fanfare. They arrive in the rain, carrying everything they have left, hoping someone will stop. Be the one who stops. If stories like this one matter to you, stories about loyalty and courage and the quiet heroism of ordinary people, then subscribe to Jack and Rex Tales. Every story we tell is a reminder that kindness is never wasted, that love does not expire, and that the best chapters of a life are sometimes the ones written after everything else seemed finished. Jack and Rex will be here, and so will we.